He was burning alive with fever, traveling toward a hot spring near a city named after his own mother, and the most powerful man who had ever lived, the man who had reunified an empire, founded a new capital, and summoned bishops from across the known world to settle the nature of God himself, had still, after more than 30 years on the throne, not been baptized. He had built churches across 3 continents. He had ended a persecution that had killed Christians by the thousands. He had presided personally over the council that produced the Nicene Creed, the very statement of faith still recited in churches today. And yet, he had spent his entire adult life as what the ancient church called a catechumen, a believer who had not yet taken the final step. And now, dying in a borrowed bed in a suburb of Nicomedia, he finally asked for the water. This is the story of Constantine, the man history remembers as the emperor who made Rome Christian, and the version most people know, the converted ruler standing beneath a sign in the sky, declaring an empire to a new faith in a single dramatic moment, is true. In its broad shape and almost completely misleading in its details. The actual man took decades to do what the legend compresses into an afternoon, and the actual empire he built was soaked in exactly the kind of political calculation, family bloodshed, and unresolved contradiction that defined every other Roman ruler before him. If you are new here, welcome. Settle in. This channel exists to find the stories that got simplified along the way and tell them properly. The research behind tonight goes deep into the actual ancient sources, Eusebius and Lactantius, and the later Roman historians who wrote with considerably less reverence. And there are details here that most popular histories skip past because they complicate the simple story of a Christian conversion. By the end, you will understand not just what Constantine believed, but the specific, considerably messier life of the man who believed it. If you have been here before, you know the pace. Let the world go quiet. We are going to Rome, and then somewhere considerably further east, because by the end of this story, Rome itself will no longer be the center of the empire at all. Here is the first thing you need
to know about Constantine. His mother was, by the most generous later account, an innkeeper's daughter, and by the less generous account, something closer to a tavern girl who served wine to soldiers passing through a small town in Bithynia, a region of Asia Minor in what is now northwestern Turkey. Her name was Helena, and the soldier who took notice of her sometime around 270 AD was a rising military officer named Constantius, a man of modest but respectable background himself, climbing steadily through the ranks of an army that was, at this period in Roman history, the only reliable path to real power. It is genuinely unclear, and was apparently unclear even to people living at the time, whether Helena and Constantius were ever formally married under Roman law. The ancient sources use the word wife in some places, and concubine in others, sometimes within the same document, and the specific legal distinction mattered enormously in Roman society, because a Roman law called the Lex Julia et Popea Popea, dating back to Augustus's own moral legislation centuries earlier, prohibited men of Constantius's rising social class from formally marrying women as far beneath them as Helena appears to have. Which means the man who would eventually be remembered as the father of the first Christian Roman emperor most likely never legally married the woman who gave birth to him at all. Constantine was born around 272 AD in a town called Nisus in what is now Serbia, and his childhood unfolded against the backdrop of one of the most unstable periods in the entire history of the Roman Empire. A string of short-lived,
frequently murdered emperors, a currency collapsing under the weight of repeated devaluation, and provinces breaking away from central control faster than any single ruler could reasonably hope to hold them together. His father's career, meanwhile, kept rising, and rising careers in this period came with a specific, brutal cost. Around 289 AD, in order to secure a marriage that would meaningfully advance his political standing, Constantius set Helena aside and married Theodora, the stepdaughter of the reigning emperor Maximian, a purely political match that bound Constantius's fortunes directly to the imperial family. Helena disappears from the historical record almost entirely for the better part of 2 decades after this, and we genuinely do not know what became of her during this period. Whether Constantius continued to support her, whether she lived in obscurity, whether she ever expected to see her son rise to the position he eventually claimed, what we do know is that young Constantine did not stay with his discarded mother. He was sent, instead, to the court of the reigning senior emperor, Diocletian, in the city of Nicomedia, ostensibly as part of his education and his preparation for an eventual career following in his father's footsteps, but functioning, in practical terms, as something considerably closer to a hostage, a guarantee held in the imperial court that Constantius would remain loyal to the increasingly elaborate power-sharing system Diocletian had constructed to manage an empire that had become by this point simply too large for any single man to govern alone. This system, which historians call the Tetrarchy, divided supreme authority among 4 men, 2 senior emperors holding the title Augustus, and 2 junior emperors holding the title Caesar, each assigned to govern and defend a specific quarter of the empire, with the expectation that the junior Caesars would eventually succeed the senior Augusti in an orderly, peaceful transition designed specifically to end the chaotic cycle of assassination and civil war that had plagued the previous century. It was, on paper, an elegant solution to Rome's structural political problem, and Constantine grew up watching it function, more or less, for the better part of 2 decades, learning firsthand exactly how fragile even the most carefully designed political arrangement could be the moment any one of the 4 men involved decided his own ambitions mattered more than the system meant to constrain them. It was during these years at Diocletian's court that Constantine would have witnessed, directly and at close range, one of the darkest chapters of the entire Tetrarchy. In 303 AD, Diocletian launched what later Christian writers would remember as the Great Persecution, a systematic campaign against the empire's Christian population. Churches destroyed, scriptures burned, Christians stripped of legal rights, and in many provinces, executed outright for refusing to renounce their faith. Constantine, by this point an experienced young officer in his late 20s, was present in Nicomedia, inside the imperial court itself, while this persecution unfolded around him. What he actually believed privately during these years is something the ancient sources simply do not tell us with any confidence. Christian writers, composing their accounts decades later with the considerable benefit
of hindsight and the considerable incentive to flatter the emperor, who had eventually become their faith's greatest patron, tend to suggest that Constantine privately sympathized with the persecuted Christians even then, while more skeptical modern historians point out that there is no contemporary evidence whatsoever for any such sympathy, and that the version of Constantine who emerges from sources written during his own lifetime looks, for the first 3 decades of his life, like an entirely conventional Roman polytheist, devoted to the traditional gods and to one solar deity in particular, with no special interest in the persecuted minority faith place his mother may or may not have already quietly belonged to. In 305 AD, the senior emperor Diocletian
did something that no Roman ruler had ever voluntarily done before. He retired, stepping down from supreme power and compelling his co-emperor Maximian to do the same, in favor of an orderly transition to the next generation of tetrarchs, an act of genuine constitutional discipline that, had it actually held, might have spared the empire decades of the civil war that was about to follow instead. It did not hold. Constantine's father Constantius became senior emperor of the western half of
the empire, and Constantine, now finally released from his long residence at Diocletian's eastern court, joined his father on a military campaign in Britain, where Constantius, already in declining health, died at the city of Eboracum, modern York, in July of 306 AD. What happened immediately after his father's death is the single most consequential moment of Constantine's entire early career, and it happened entirely outside the careful constitutional machinery the Tetrarchy had been specifically designed to protect. The soldiers present at Eboracum, loyal to Constantius and now standing beside his son, simply proclaimed Constantine emperor on the spot, raising him on a shield in the traditional acclamation of a new Augustus, with no consultation whatsoever with the other tetrarchs, whose cooperation the entire system depended on. It was, in the most literal sense, exactly the kind of irregular, army-driven succession that the Tetrarchy had been built to prevent, and the senior Eastern emperor, Galerius, recognized it as such immediately. After tense negotiation, Galerius agreed to recognize Constantine, but only with the reduced title of Caesar, rather than the full Augustus his father had held, a deliberate demotion designed to remind the ambitious young man that the system, however
irregular his own rise to it had been, still expected him to wait his turn. Constantine accepted the reduced title for the moment, a decision that reveals something genuinely important about how he operated throughout his entire career. He was, again and again, willing to accept a temporary, technically inferior position when the alternative was open conflict he was not yet certain of winning. Patience deployed strategically rather than out of any genuine deference, biding time until circumstances shifted enough in his favor to make a more direct claim. Those circumstances arrived quickly. The tetrarchic system, already weakened by the irregular nature of Constantine's own accession, collapsed further when a man named Maxentius, the son of the retired emperor Maximian, was proclaimed emperor in Rome itself by the Praetorian Guard, in direct defiance of the official tetrarchic succession plan. By 308 AD, the supposedly orderly system Diocletian had designed now had, depending on how generously you counted competing claims, somewhere between 4 and 6 men simultaneously claiming legitimate imperial authority across different parts of the empire, a level of chaos the entire tetrarchy had been specifically built to eliminate. Constantine spent the years that followed consolidating his position in Gaul and Britain, fighting successful campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier that built his military reputation and the loyalty of his troops, while watching the rest of the tetrarchic system disintegrate into open rivalry. His own position was complicated by an uncomfortable family connection. His wife at the time, a woman named Minervina, had given him a son, Crispus, born around 305. But Minervina herself disappears from the record around 307, likely having died, or possibly having been set aside. The sources are not entirely clear. Because that same year, Constantine married Fausta, the daughter of the retired emperor Maximian, and therefore the sister of Maxentius, the very rival whose claim to Rome directly threatened Constantine's own ambitions. This meant that the marriage binding Constantine into the Maximian family
was, from the very beginning, a marriage to the sister of a man he would eventually have to defeat in open war, a tension the ancient sources do not dwell on at length, but that sits, in retrospect, as an early and genuinely uncomfortable preview of exactly the kind of family complication that would define the darkest chapter of Constantine's later reign. Maximian himself, the retired emperor and Constantine's new
father-in-law, proved unable to stay retired, attempting at least one plot against his own son-in-law's position, before Constantine, after the plot was discovered, gave him the choice of suicide over execution. Maximian hanged himself in 310 AD, and Constantine, in a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives, began, in the years immediately following, to construct an entirely new claim about his own ancestry, suggesting through carefully managed public propaganda that he was actually descended from the much earlier and considerably more respected emperor, Claudius Gothicus, a claim with essentially no genuine historical basis, but that served the immediate political purpose of distancing Constantine's own legitimacy from the now disgraced and dead Maximian, his father-in-law turned enemy turned inconvenient family connection he needed the public to forget. By 312 AD, the rivalry between Constantine and Maxentius for control of the western half of the empire had become impossible to resolve through anything other than open war. Maxentius controlled Rome and Italy with a significantly larger army than Constantine could field, and Constantine, against the advice of several of his own commanders, who considered the campaign reckless given the disparity in forces, marched south into Italy to settle the conflict directly. It is this campaign and the specific battle that decided it that would produce the single most famous and most heavily mythologized moment of Constantine's entire life. The popular version of what happened before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge goes something like this. Constantine looked up into the sky, saw a cross of light, heard a voice telling him that by this sign he would conquer, ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol on their shields, and won a decisive victory that instantly converted him to Christianity on the spot. The actual historical record is considerably messier and considerably more interesting, because we have two genuinely independent ancient accounts of what happened, and they do not agree with each other in ways that matter. The earlier account, written by a Christian writer named Lactantius, probably within a year of the battle itself, describes a dream, not a vision in the sky at all, occurring the night before the battle, in which Constantine was instructed to mark his soldiers' shields with a heavenly sign, which Lactantius identifies as a specific symbol, a combination of the Greek letters chi and rho, the first two letters of the word Christ. That would become known as the chi rho. There is no daytime vision, no inscription blazing across the sky, simply a dream and a practical instruction about battlefield markings. The second account, considerably more famous, comes from Eusebius of Caesarea, the bishop who would eventually become Constantine's own court historian and biographer. Writing his account of Constantine's life decades later, after the emperor's death, claiming to have heard the story directly from Constantine himself, years after the fact, and swearing to its truth with an oath. In this version, Constantine saw an actual vision in the daytime sky, a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "By this sign you shall conquer." And only afterward, that same night, did he have the dream confirming what the symbol meant and instructing him to use it. It is genuinely worth sitting with how different these two accounts are, written by two different Christian authors, with every reason to want the same flattering story to be true, and yet unable to agree on whether the central miraculous event happened in the sky during the day or only in a dream at night.
modern historians generally treat
This discrepancy as strong evidence that whatever happened, it was considerably less clean and considerably more open to retrospective embellishment than either single account, taken alone, would suggest. There is a further complication that almost never makes it into popular retellings. The Arch of Constantine, a massive triumphal monument built in Rome just 3 years after the battle, specifically to commemorate this exact victory, contains absolutely no reference to any vision, any Christian symbol, or any divine sign whatsoever. Its inscription credits the victory to the prompting of a divinity, instinctu divinitatis, a deliberately vague phrase that could satisfy pagan and Christian observers equally, and its sculptural reliefs depict entirely conventional imagery of imperial victory, with no cross, no Chi-Rho, no Christian iconography of any kind. The monument that Constantine himself approved, standing in the city where the battle was won, tells a noticeably less dramatic story than the one later Christian biography would eventually settle on. Whatever actually happened, in whatever form, on the eve of the 28th of October, 312 AD, Constantine's army met Maxentius's considerably larger force at the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, and won decisively. Maxentius's own troops, retreating in disorder across a
Hastily constructed pontoon bridge that collapsed under the weight of the panicked retreat, drowned in significant numbers in the Tiber, Maxentius himself among them, his body recovered from the river the following day, and his head, in the traditional Roman manner of confirming a usurper's death to the public, paraded through the streets of Rome on a spear. Constantine entered Rome as its unchallenged master, and whatever the precise nature of his battlefield experience had actually been, he began, from this point forward, extending genuinely unprecedented favor toward the empire's Christian population, restoring property that had been confiscated during the persecutions, granting the Christian church significant legal privileges, and, the following year, meeting with his eastern counterpart Licinius at Milan to formalize what would become one of the most consequential documents in the history of Western religion, the Edict of Milan. Issued in 313 AD, did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, a common misconception that deserves correcting directly. What it actually did was establish religious toleration as official policy, guaranteeing Christians, and indeed people of every faith, the legal right to worship according to their own conscience, without fear of persecution. A genuinely radical departure.
From centuries of Roman religious policy that had, at various points, persecuted not only Christians, but Jews, certain mystery cult followers, and other groups whose practices the state found politically threatening, it is worth emphasizing how significant this distinction actually is. Constantine did not, in 313 AD, outlaw paganism or compel anyone to convert. He created legal space for Christianity to exist and grow without fear, while simultaneously continuing, for years afterward, to maintain many of the outward religious practices and titles that bound the traditional Roman state to its old gods, including, for a significant portion of his reign, the title Pontifex Maximus, the very office of chief pagan priest that Julius Caesar had once bribed his way into, and that Augustus had held for the rest of his own life centuries earlier. The man who would eventually be remembered as the emperor who Christianized Rome spent years governing as something considerably more ambiguous, a ruler who favored Christianity with genuine, escalating enthusiasm, while continuing to function, in significant respects, as the head of the empire's traditional religious establishment as well, a contradiction that the Christian sources, writing after his death, worked hard to smooth over, and that the
actual coinage and inscriptions from his own reign stubbornly refused to fully resolve. With Maxentius dead, the western half of the empire belonged to Constantine alone, but the eastern half remained in the hands of Licinius, the man Constantine had met at Milan and bound to himself through the marriage of his own half-sister Constantia, a political alliance that, like nearly every other political marriage in the history of Roman power-sharing, was built to last only as long as both men found it useful. It lasted about a decade. The two men fought an initial round of inconclusive warfare in 316 and 317 AD, settling into an uneasy peace that divided the empire's territory between them, while leaving the underlying rivalry completely unresolved. And the religious dimension of that rivalry sharpened considerably as the years passed. Licinius, who had himself been a co-signer of the Edict of Milan and had shown no particular hostility toward Christians in the years immediately following, began by the early 320s reversing course, restricting Christian gatherings, removing Christians from positions of authority in his eastern provinces, and by several Christian sources writing afterward, resuming outright persecution in certain areas. Whether Licinius's shift was
driven by genuine religious conviction or by the more straightforward political calculation that Constantine's own well-publicized Christian sympathies made loyalty to Christianity within Licinius's own territory look increasingly like loyalty to a rival emperor, is a question the ancient sources do not answer with any real confidence. But the practical effect was to hand Constantine an enormously useful pretext. When the two men finally went to war again in 324 AD, Constantine was able to present the conflict not as another round of the same tired Roman civil war his soldiers had already fought through twice before, but as a holy war, a Christian emperor marching to liberate persecuted believers from a pagan tyrant. The same basic propaganda strategy, recast for a new religious age, that Augustus had once used to frame his war against Antony as a defense of Roman values against a corrupting foreign queen, rather than simply another contest between Roman rivals. It worked. Constantine won decisively at the battles of Adrianople and Chrysopolis, and Licinius surrendered. Constantine's sister Constantia personally interceding to secure her husband's life, and Constantine, in a show of clemency reminiscent of the careful theater Augustus had once performed with his own victims,
defeated rivals initially spared him, allowing him to live in comfortable retirement. This mercy did not last. Within a year, Licinius was executed, on the grounds, by Constantine's own official explanation, that he had been caught attempting to incite a fresh rebellion, though several ancient sources express considerable skepticism about how genuine that justification actually was. And the pattern, a defeated rival spared publicly and then quietly eliminated once the political danger of letting him live became clear, would recur with even more devastating consequences within Constantine's own family just 2 years later. With Licinius dead, Constantine stood, for the first time since Diocletian's original division of power nearly 4 decades earlier, as the sole and unchallenged ruler of the entire Roman Empire, East and West reunified under a single emperor, a genuinely remarkable achievement that the Tetrarchy's careful architects had never actually managed to sustain among themselves. It is worth pausing here, before turning to the consequences of that reunification, on what Constantine actually looked like and how he actually lived, because the popular image, drawn largely from idealized later Christian portraiture, tends to flatten him into a generic, dignified imperial figure, considerably less specific than the man the same. Ancient sources actually describe he was, by most accounts, physically imposing, tall and powerfully built, with a neck ancient writers specifically described as thick and strong, a detail that later commentators connected to his reputation for genuine physical strength and stamina on campaign. His hair, in his official portraiture, is depicted in a distinctive style, swept back from the forehead in a manner that broke from the close-cropped military styles favored by the soldier emperors of the previous half-century, a small but deliberate visual signal that Constantine wished to be seen as something more than simply another general who had seized the throne through force. He was, by several accounts, a notably restless and energetic ruler, constantly on the move between different parts of his vast territory, rather than settling permanently in any single capital, a pattern that several modern historians have connected to the simple practical reality that an empire this size, still facing real military threats on multiple frontiers, required an emperor willing to personally appear wherever the immediate crisis happened to be, rather than governing entirely through distant correspondence. He was also, increasingly as his reign progressed, drawn toward genuinely elaborate court ceremony, adopting forms of address and visual presentation, jeweled diadems, ornate robes, a deliberately cultivated distance between the emperor and even his own highest officials that moved noticeably further from the deliberately modest first citizen styling that Augustus had spent his entire reign cultivating, and considerably closer to the kind of visibly exalted, almost sacred monarchy that later Byzantine emperors would take for granted as the natural order of things. Constantine, in this specific sense, represents a genuine hinge point in the entire history of how Roman rulers presented themselves. The careful republican fiction Augustus had constructed and maintained for centuries, finally openly abandoned in favor of something considerably closer to undisguised royal majesty. Reunifying the empire solved one problem and immediately exposed another, considerably less amenable to solution through military force. The church Constantine had spent over a decade favoring and protecting was, by the mid-320s, tearing itself apart over a theological dispute that had nothing to do with politics in any conventional sense, and everything to do with a question that had genuinely divided sincere believers across the Eastern Mediterranean: the precise relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son. A priest named Arius, based in Alexandria, had been teaching that the Son was a created being, distinct from and subordinate to the Father, brought into existence at a specific point, rather than having existed eternally alongside him. A position that struck Arius's opponents, led by his own bishop, Alexander, and later carried forward with particular intellectual force by a young deacon named Athanasius, as a fundamental and dangerous error, one that, if left unchecked, threatened to undermine the entire Christian understanding of salvation itself. The dispute spread rapidly across the eastern provinces, splitting congregations, bishops, and entire cities into bitterly opposed factions. And Constantine, who had spent over a decade cultivating Christianity specifically as a unifying force for an empire desperately in need of unity after a century of civil war, found himself confronting the deeply uncomfortable reality that the religion he had bet his entire reign on was now actively fracturing along exactly the kind of regional and factional lines he had hoped it would help dissolve. His response, in 325 AD, was to summon bishops from across the entire Christian world to a single council held at the city of Nicaea in Asia Minor, an assembly historians now generally regard as the first genuinely ecumenical, empire-wide gathering in the history of the Christian Church. Somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 bishops attended, traveling, in many cases, enormous distances at imperial expense. And Constantine himself, a man who had not yet been formally baptized into the faith these bishops had devoted their entire lives to, personally presided over significant portions of the proceedings, an almost unimaginable position for a layman to occupy in the eyes of the assembled clergy,
and one that tells you something genuinely important about how completely Constantine had come to see himself as the church's protector and arbiter, regardless of his own still unresolved personal religious status.
The council ultimately sided against Arius, producing the statement of faith now known as the Nicene Creed, affirming that the Son was of one substance with the Father, homoousios in the original Greek, a single technical term that would go on to define Orthodox Christian theology for the rest of recorded history, and that, at the time, satisfied almost nobody completely. The theological dispute Nicaea was supposed to resolve did not actually end with the council's verdict. It continued in various forms for the remainder of Constantine's reign and for generations afterward, with Arius himself eventually rehabilitated and readmitted to communion before his own death, and Constantine's own theological sympathies drifting in his final years in directions considerably more favorable to the very position the council he had personally convened had officially condemned. It is worth noting because it complicates the popular image of Nicaea as a triumphant moment of settled Christian unity, that the emperor who presided over the council that produced the foundational statement of Christian orthodoxy spent the rest of his life surrounded by bishops on both sides of the dispute, repeatedly intervening, exiling and recalling various church leaders as the political and theological winds shifted.
A pattern that looks considerably less like a man with fixed theological convictions, and considerably more like a ruler treating doctrinal unity as a practical political problem to be managed, rather than a settled truth to be simply enforced. It was during this same general period that Constantine made the decision that would, in the long run, prove every bit as consequential as anything he accomplished on a battlefield or in a church council: the founding of an entirely new imperial capital, built on the site of an ancient Greek city called Byzantium, strategically positioned on the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, controlling access between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The new city, dedicated in 330 AD, and named with a directness that left no ambiguity about its founder's intentions, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was built with breathtaking speed and on a genuinely massive scale. New walls, a new forum, a hippodrome for chariot racing modeled on Rome's own Circus Maximus, and, in a detail that tells you everything about the city's intended religious character, churches built directly into its founding plan from the very beginning, rather than added incrementally over centuries the way Rome's own Christian church.
Architecture had been forced to accumulate amid the older city's existing pagan temples. Constantine reportedly stripped works of art and architectural materials from across the empire to adorn his new capital. Statues and columns transported from older cities to lend the new foundation instant visual gravity it could not otherwise have accumulated on its own in just a few years of construction. A kind of deliberate, borrowed grandeur that several ancient sources record with a mixture of admiration and faint scandal at the sheer scale of the appropriation involved. The decision to build an entirely new capital, rather than simply governing from old Rome itself, deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it represents, in its own quiet way, just as significant a break with tradition as anything in Constantine's religious policy. Rome had been the unquestioned center of the empire for over 1,000 years. The city's name was, in a very real sense, synonymous with the empire itself, and Constantine's decision to relocate the genuine seat of imperial power eastward to a city with no inherited weight of pagan tradition, no entrenched senatorial aristocracy jealously guarding its ancient privileges, and considerably easier access to the frontiers, where
the empire's most pressing military threats now actually originated,
set in motion a slow but ultimately irreversible shift in the center of gravity of Roman civilization. Within less than 2 centuries, the western half of the empire, with old Rome still nominally at its heart, would collapse entirely under the pressure of migrating peoples it could no longer hold back, while the eastern half, governed from the city Constantine built, would continue under the name historians now call the Byzantine Empire for another 1100 years, making Constantinople, by any reasonable accounting, the single most consequential urban planning decision in the entire history of Western civilization. It is worth returning to the new capital in more physical detail than the earlier narration allowed, because the sheer scale and speed of what Constantine actually built there deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than simply as a footnote to his religious and political legacy. The site he chose had genuine, almost unbeatable strategic logic behind it. Positioned on a peninsula bordered by the Bosphorus Strait, the Sea of Marmara, and a natural deep-water harbor that ancient sailors called the Golden Horn, the location controlled simultaneously the maritime trade
route connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and the land route connecting Europe to Asia Minor. A single city occupying one of the most genuinely valuable pieces of geography in the entire ancient world. A strategic advantage so durable that the city would remain a coveted imperial capital for well over 1,000 years after Constantine's own death. Fought over by Byzantine emperors, crusaders, and eventually the Ottoman Turks, who finally captured it in 1453 and made it their own capital under the name Istanbul. The same city, continuously inhabited and continuously fought over, that still occupies that exact peninsula today. The construction itself proceeded at a pace that ancient observers found genuinely remarkable. Constantine reportedly drove the boundary of the new city's walls personally, marking out a far larger circuit than the old Greek city of Byzantium had ever occupied, anticipating growth on a scale that, within just a few generations, the city would in fact require. When courtiers reportedly asked him how much further he intended to extend the walls, he is said to have replied only that he would continue until the figure walking ahead of him, a divine guide visible by Eusebius's account to Constantine, alone finally chose to stop. A detail that, whether literally true or simply the kind of pious embellishment that accumulated around every major decision of his reign, captures the genuinely audacious scale of what he was attempting. Within the walls, Constantine constructed an enormous hippodrome for chariot racing, deliberately modeled on Rome's own Circus Maximus, and serving an identical political function, providing the city's population with the kind of large-scale public entertainment that Roman rulers, since Augustus's own deliberate cultivation of bread and circuses centuries earlier, understood to be essential to maintaining the loyalty and good humor of an urban population, otherwise prone to genuine civic unrest. A new imperial forum, a senate house intended to give the new capital at least the appearance of the same republican institutional trappings the old Roman Senate still nominally possessed, and an extensive new palace complex for the imperial court itself. The religious architecture received particular attention and particular resources. The Hagia Sophia, the church that would eventually become the single most architecturally influential building in the entire history of Byzantine and later Ottoman religious construction, was first built during this same general period, though the magnificent domed structure that survives and
still stands in modern Istanbul today is actually a later reconstruction, built under the Emperor Justinian, roughly 2 centuries after Constantine's own original, considerably more modest church on the same site, burned down amid civil unrest.
Constantine reportedly populated his new capital not simply with new construction, but with treasures stripped from across the empire. Statues of gods and heroes transported from Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor. Repurposed, in many cases, as purely secular civic decoration, rather than objects of continued religious veneration. A deliberate strategy that allowed the new Christian capital to display the accumulated artistic glory of centuries of pagan civilization, while carefully stripping that art of its original religious function. Beauty preserved, worship discouraged. A microcosm in miniature of exactly the broader religious transition Constantine's entire reign was engineering across the empire as a whole. The city's population grew with extraordinary speed, drawn by imperial incentives, free grain distributions, modeled directly on the same policy Augustus had once used to secure the loyalty of old Rome's own urban poor, and the simple magnetic pole of proximity to wherever the actual seat of imperial power happened to reside. Within a few generations, Constantinople had grown into one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the entire world, a position it would hold, with periods of decline and recovery, for well over 1,000 years, making it, by any reasonable measure, the single most successful and most enduring urban foundation any Roman emperor ever personally commissioned, considerably more durable in the end than old Rome itself, which would be sacked by invading peoples within less than a century of Constantine's own death, while his new eastern capital continued to stand and to govern a continuously surviving Roman state for 11 more centuries after that. It is the year 326 AD, the very same year as the 20th anniversary celebrations of Constantine's own reign, that the single darkest and least explicable episode of his entire life occurred, and it is worth telling completely, because most popular accounts of Constantine either skip it entirely or compress it into a single uncomfortable sentence before moving quickly back to the church councils and the new capital. Crispus was Constantine's eldest son, born around 305 to Minervina, the first wife, or possibly concubine, who had disappeared from the record once Constantine married Fausta. And by every account that survives, Crispus had grown into exactly the kind of heir a Roman emperor could be genuinely proud of. Made Caesar in 317 at just 12 years old, given real military command in Gaul by his late teens, and, crucially, the actual commander who won the decisive naval victory at the Battle of the Hellespont in 324, the engagement that, alongside Constantine's own land victory at Chrysopolis, finally broke Licinius's resistance and delivered the reunified empire into Constantine's hands. Eusebius himself, writing while Crispus was still alive, praised him in terms that left no doubt about how highly the young Caesar was regarded, comparing him favorably to his own celebrated father. Within roughly 2 years of that triumph, Crispus was dead, executed on his father's direct order at a town called Pola on the Istrian Peninsula in what is now Croatia, and shortly afterward, Fausta, Constantine's wife of nearly 2 decades and the mother of 3 sons who would eventually inherit the empire, was dead as well, by several ancient accounts, suffocated in an overheated bath, a method of execution so unusual that historians have spent the better part of 2,000 years trying to determine whether it was even accurate, let alone why it was chosen. No official explanation survives. None of the Christian sources writing closest to Constantine's own lifetime, including Eusebius, who had every reason to record anything that reflected well on his patron, and every reason to omit anything that did not, mention the executions at all. The silence itself is its own kind of evidence. Both Crispus and Fausta were subjected to damnatio memoria,
the formal Roman practice of erasing a condemned person's name and image from public record. Inscriptions chiseled away, statues melted down or defaced. An attempt at total historical erasure that, ironically, only succeeded in making the absence itself conspicuous, enough that later writers, working with considerably less reliable information and considerably more appetite for scandal, rushed to fill the silence with theories. The most persistent later account, recorded by the Byzantine historian Zosimus and others, claims that Fausta accused Crispus of attempting to rape her, or alternatively, that the two had engaged in a consensual affair, an accusation of incest layered directly onto an accusation of treason that enraged Constantine enough to order his own son's death, and that Constantine's mother, Helena, devastated by the loss of her favorite grandson, then confronted her son, revealing or strongly suggesting
that Fausta's accusation had been a deliberate fabrication designed specifically to remove the popular, battle-proven elder son and clear the path to the throne for Fausta's own 3 sons instead, and that Constantine, persuaded of his wife's deception, ordered her own execution in turn.
Modern historians treat this entire narrative with considerable skepticism, not because it is impossible, but because it bears a suspicious resemblance to a very old and very familiar story pattern from Greek mythology. The tale of Phaedra falsely accusing her stepson Hippolytus of rape after he rejected her advances, a story every educated person in the ancient Mediterranean world would have recognized instantly, which makes later writers' eagerness to retell Constantine's family tragedy in almost exactly the same shape considerably less reliable as literal history, and considerably more useful as evidence of how readily scandal attaches itself to powerful families, once enough time has passed for nobody left alive to contradict the story. Other modern theories range just as widely. Some scholars have proposed that Crispus and Fausta were executed for entirely separate reasons, Crispus possibly implicated in some kind of genuine political conspiracy, or simply grown dangerously popular and threatening in his father's eyes, and Fausta's death connected instead to a botched attempt to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, using the ancient belief that extreme heat could induce a miscarriage. One researcher has specifically argued this exact theory, that Fausta died from complications of a deliberately induced abortion, rather than any theory of a false accusation.
Execution at all, while still other historians simply admit with admirable honesty that the genuine cause may never be recoverable from the sources that survive. The deaths happened close together, in the same year, both subjects of immediate and total erasure from the official record, and 2,000 years of retrospective theorizing has produced theories, but no actual certainty. What we do know, with considerably more confidence, is what Constantine did afterward. Several ancient pagan sources, hostile to Constantine's Christianity and eager to connect his personal sins to his religious choices, claim that Constantine, tormented by guilt over killing his own son and wife, sought out pagan priests for purification rites, was reportedly told that no such rite existed capable of cleansing a crime of this magnitude, and only then turned, in desperation, to Christianity, specifically because Christian teaching offered something the old religion could not, the promise of forgiveness for even the most monstrous sin, through repentance and eventual baptism. Christian sources, predictably, do not record this version of events at all, and modern historians generally treat it as hostile pagan polemic rather than reliable history, a story designed specifically to suggest that Constantine's entire embrace of Christianity was
rooted not in genuine conviction, but in a guilty man's search for an easy escape from accountability. But the fact that this particular slander gained enough currency to survive in the historical record at all tells you something true about how unresolved
and how genuinely disturbing contemporaries and near contemporaries found the deaths of Crispus and Fausta to be. Even Constantine's own defenders, writing decades after the fact, simply could not bring themselves to mention it. Helena, whatever role she actually played in the unfolding tragedy, left Rome not long afterward, in her late 70s, on an extended pilgrimage to the Holy Land, distributing alms, founding churches at the sites associated with Christ's birth and death, and, according to a legend that emerges considerably later in the historical record than the events it describes, personally overseeing excavations at Golgotha that uncovered the actual wooden cross on which Jesus had been crucified, identified, in the most popular version of the story, through a miracle in which contact with the relic healed a dying woman. The historian closest to these actual events, Eusebius, who wrote in considerable detail about Helena's journey to Palestine and the churches she funded there, makes no mention
whatsoever of any cross being discovered. The legend of the true cross first appears in surviving sources roughly 60 years after Helena's own death, which means that one of the most enduring and most visually powerful stories in the entire history of Christian relic veneration was almost certainly a later pious invention, attached retroactively to a genuinely historical pilgrimage by an elderly empress whose actual, documented achievements, the churches she funded, the poor she fed, the dignity she lent to Christianity's holiest sites through sheer imperial patronage, were apparently not considered miraculous enough on their own to satisfy the appetite of the generations that followed her. It is worth returning briefly to the women who moved through Constantine's life and court, because their stories, scattered across the political narrative, deserve to be drawn together as their own thread, the way the women in every reign this channel has covered tend to carry consequences the official, male-centered record often treats as secondary. Constantia, Constantine's half-sister through his father's second marriage to Theodora, occupied a position of genuine political consequence for most of her adult life. Married to Licinius, specifically to seal the alliance between the two men following the
Edict of Milan. She personally intervened to save her husband's life when his war against her own brother ended in defeat. A genuinely difficult position for any woman to occupy, caught directly between a husband and a brother locked in a contest for the entire Roman world, and one she navigated, at least in the moment, successfully, though Licinius's eventual execution the following year suggests her influence, however real in the immediate aftermath of his surrender, had clear and fairly narrow limits once Constantine's own political calculations shifted again. Constantia also appears in several ancient accounts to have held genuine personal sympathy for the Arian position in the theological controversy that would consume so much of her brother's later reign, reportedly recommending an Arian-leaning priest to Constantine's own attention shortly before her death, a detail that connects, in a quiet and rarely noticed way, directly to the considerably more favorable treatment Constantine's own theological sympathies would eventually show toward the Arian position in his final years, suggesting that the emperor who presided so visibly over the council that condemned Arius may have been influenced in his own private convictions by a sister whose own theological leanings ran in exactly
the opposite direction. Helena's own position within the imperial family deserves one final piece of attention beyond her pilgrimage and the later cross legend, because the timeline of her own elevation tells its own quiet story. Set aside by Constantine's father decades earlier in favor of a more politically useful marriage, living in genuine obscurity for the better part of 20 years, she was, upon her son's rise to power, not merely welcomed back into public life, but elevated by 324 AD to the formal title of Augusta, sharing that exact honor in a detail that must have produced its own particular tension within the household, with Fausta, the very woman whose own father had once been part of the political maneuvering that originally pushed Helena aside
in favor of a more advantageous match. Two women, one elevated late in life after decades of quiet obscurity, the other born directly into the imperial family her father had helped lead, sharing the same formal title at the same imperial court, in the same year that would, within roughly 24 months, end with one of them dead by her own son's order, and the other, by several ancient accounts, the very baby.
The person whose grief and intervention may have helped seal that fate. It is exactly the kind of detail that the political narrative of councils and currency reforms tends to leave entirely out of frame, and exactly the kind of detail that makes the human reality of Constantine's court considerably more vivid and considerably more uncomfortable than the marble busts and the church mosaics ever suggest. Stepping back from the family tragedy and the religious councils, it is worth examining the considerably less dramatic, but arguably more consequential work of actually governing the reunified empire. Because Constantine, like Augustus before him, understood that personal authority, however absolute, eventually depends on the durability of the institutions built to outlast it. He inherited and substantially completed a series of administrative reforms that Diocletian had begun decades earlier, further dividing the empire's provinces into smaller, more manageable units, and grouping these provinces into larger administrative blocks called dioceses, a term the Christian Church would eventually borrow for its own organizational structure, with considerably more durability than the secular boundaries it was originally modeled on. The entire system was overseen by a small number of praetorian prefects, each responsible for a vast quarter of the empire, a structure of layered, hierarchical bureaucracy that represented a genuine departure from the comparatively simple provincial administration of the early empire centuries earlier. Constantine also undertook a significant reorganization of the Roman military, separating the army more clearly into mobile field units capable of responding quickly to threats anywhere within a given region, and garrison troops stationed more permanently along the empire's frontiers, a structural change that historians have long debated the merits of, some arguing it provided the flexibility a sprawling, multi-front empire genuinely needed, others arguing it diluted the concentrated strength along the frontiers that had once made Roman defenses so formidable, and may have contributed, decades after Constantine's own death, to the empire's increasing difficulty containing the migrations and invasions that would eventually overwhelm its western half entirely. He abolished the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit Augustus had created over 3 centuries earlier specifically to protect the emperor's person, but that had, in the centuries since, become one of the single most politically destabilizing forces in the entire empire, repeatedly making and breaking emperors according to its own institutional interests, rather than any genuine loyalty to the office itself. The Guard had backed Maxentius in the civil war that ended at the Milvian Bridge, and Constantine, having defeated them on the battlefield, simply dissolved the institution entirely once victory was secured, replacing it with smaller, more tightly controlled household guard units with considerably less independent political weight, a structural fix to a problem that had plagued the Roman state since the very founding of the office centuries earlier. Perhaps Constantine's single most consequential economic reform was the introduction of a new gold coin, the solidus, struck at a carefully controlled weight and purity that, unlike the wildly debased currencies of the previous chaotic century, actually held its value. The solidus would remain the stable foundation of the Roman and then Byzantine monetary system for the next 700 years, an almost unimaginable span of continuous economic stability built on a single currency reform. And the very word solidus, through a winding linguistic path across French and English, is the distant ancestor of the modern word soldier, since Roman troops were paid in exactly this coin.
a small but genuinely remarkable thread connecting Constantine's 4th century monetary policy directly to a word still used in every modern army today. The reform came with a genuinely
brutal cost that popular accounts of Constantine's economic achievements tend to skip entirely. The gold needed to mint these new, reliable coins had to come from somewhere, and a significant portion of it was extracted through the heavy taxation and outright confiscation of pagan temple treasures across the empire. Gold and silver cult statues melted down, temple treasuries seized. A policy that, whatever its religious motivations might or might not have included, generated the literal precious metal that backed the most stable currency the ancient world had seen in generations. Constantine's monetary triumph and his religious policy were, in this very direct and very physical sense, never actually separable from one another. His legal reforms reveal a similarly mixed picture, genuinely humane in certain specific respects and harshly traditional or even regressive in others. He introduced legislation restricting the most brutal excesses of gladiatorial combat, though he did not abolish the institution outright. He made it more difficult for masters to separate enslaved families through sale, a genuine, if limited, humanitarian improvement, and he strengthened legal protections for abandoned children.
A category of person Roman law had historically treated with considerable indifference. At the same time, he hardened existing Roman law in ways that fell hardest on women and on Jewish communities. His adultery legislation, building directly on the framework Augustus had established 3 centuries earlier, applied with particular severity to women, and Constantine specifically reaffirmed and tightened restrictions on intermarriage between Jews and Christians, and on Jewish ownership of Christian slaves, codifying into Roman law a degree of formal discrimination against Jewish communities that earlier, more religiously neutral Roman administration had not generally enforced with this same systematic intensity. A set of policies that historians studying the long, difficult history of Christian and Jewish relations in Europe have generally identified as a genuinely significant and unfortunate early milestone. The moment imperial law itself began actively, formally discriminating along explicitly religious lines, rather than simply tolerating or persecuting based on the more diffuse political loyalty tests of the earlier pagan empire. It is worth holding all of this together at once, because it resists the kind of simple, single sentence.
The verdict that popular history often prefers. The same emperor who built a currency stable enough to anchor an empire for 7 centuries melted down pagan temples to do it. The same emperor who protected abandoned children and enslaved families from particular cruelties hardened the legal position of Jewish communities for generations to come. Constantine's actual governance, examined closely rather than through the simplified lens of either Christian hagiography or secular condemnation, looks considerably more like what it actually was, the work of an enormously capable, enormously pragmatic ruler, making a continuous stream of difficult, often genuinely contradictory choices, rather than the consistent, unified moral program either his admirers or his critics have frequently wanted to find in it. There is a specific military object that deserves its own attention, because it physically embodies the exact ambiguity that defined Constantine's entire religious life: the labarum, a military standard he introduced sometime after the Milvian Bridge, consisting of a cross-shaped staff topped with the Chi Rho symbol from Lactantius's account of the dream, with a cloth banner bearing the images of the
Constantine and his sons hanging beneath it. Roman military standards had, for centuries, carried images closely tied to traditional religious and imperial cult practice. Eagles, portraits of the emperor presented for veneration by the assembled troops. The Labarum took this entirely familiar Roman military object and simply replaced its religious content with explicitly Christian symbolism, while keeping the imperial portraiture exactly where it had always been. Soldiers who had spent their entire careers saluting standards bearing religious imagery now saluted standards bearing Christian religious imagery instead. The underlying structure of military devotion to a sacred symbol carried directly forward, completely unchanged, while its specific content was simply, deliberately swapped out. Constantine became, over the following 2 decades, one of history's most prolific religious patrons, funding an extraordinary program of church construction across the empire. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, built over the site Christian tradition identified as both the crucifixion and the resurrection. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and in Rome itself, an enormous new basilica built over what tradition held to be the burial.
The site of the Apostle Peter, the building that would, many centuries and several complete reconstructions later, become the foundation beneath the modern St. Peter's Basilica, the literal physical and spiritual centre of the entire Roman Catholic Church. It is worth pausing on the specific, genuinely strange position Constantine occupied within the church, whose growth he was funding so lavishly. He was not a bishop, he held no formal office within the church's clerical hierarchy, and for most of his reign he had not even been baptized. And yet he behaved consistently as something considerably more than a generous outside patron, summoning councils, exiling and recalling bishops according to his own political judgment, and, according to one famous remark Eusebius records him making to a gathering of bishops, describing himself as something like a bishop appointed by God to oversee those outside the church, a phrase that later historians have spent considerable energy trying to unpack, since it suggests Constantine genuinely saw himself as occupying a unique, semi-sacred role, standing between the secular empire and the institutional church, answerable to God directly for the well-being of both, rather than simply a powerful layman who happened to write generous checks. This self-conception had genuinely significant consequences beyond the well-known Arian controversy in the East. In North Africa, a parallel and considerably less famous schism, known to historians as the Donatist controversy, had emerged even before Constantine's rise to power, rooted in a bitter dispute over how the church should treat clergy who had compromised with Roman authorities during the recent persecutions, rather than facing martyrdom outright. A rigorist faction, taking its name from a bishop called Donatus, refused to recognise the authority of any clergy they considered to have been tainted by this compromise, splitting North African Christianity into 2 openly hostile churches that would continue competing for the loyalty of the same congregations for the better part of a century. Constantine, almost immediately after the Edict of Milan, found himself drawn directly into this dispute. Petitioned by both sides to rule on which faction represented the legitimate church, he convened councils, ruled against the Donatists, and when his rulings failed to actually resolve anything on the ground, eventually authorized the use of imperial troops to physically suppress Donatist resistance in certain North African cities, a use of state violence to enforce a specifically internal Christian theological dispute that represents, in its own quiet way, just as significant a precedent as anything decided at Nicaea.
the moment a Roman emperor first deployed the machinery of the state specifically to compel conformity among competing Christian factions, rather than simply tolerating Christianity's existence within a still broadly pluralistic religious landscape. It did not work. The Donatist Church survived underground for generations, continuing to compete with mainstream North African Christianity right up until the Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century finally rendered the entire dispute moot by removing Christian dominance from the region altogether. A sobering reminder that even an emperor with seemingly unlimited authority, willing to deploy actual military force in pursuit of religious uniformity, could not simply legislate a sincere theological disagreement out of existence. A lesson Constantine, judging by his continued, repeated interventions in the considerably
larger and more consequential Arian controversy for the rest of his life, appears never to have fully internalized. There is a piece of physical evidence that complicates the simple, dramatic conversion narrative more thoroughly than almost anything else available to historians, and it survives in enormous quantity in museum collections and private coin cabinets across the world. Constantine's own minted currency. For years after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, after the vision or the dream, or whatever combination of the two had actually occurred, Constantine continued minting coins bearing the image and name of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a solar deity that had been elevated to the position of supreme imperial patron god decades earlier under the Emperor Aurelian, and that Constantine's own father, Constantius, had personally favored as well. One particularly well-known issue, struck around 313, the very same year as the Edict of Milan itself, bears Constantine's own portrait on one side and the god Sol on the other, with an inscription describing the sun god as the emperor's companion, Soli Invicto Comiti, the kind
of explicit, official religious statement that simply cannot be reconciled with the idea of an emperor who had, by this point, already become a fully committed, exclusively monotheistic Christian. Official imperial coinage continued to feature Sol Invictus for well over a decade after the battle that supposedly marked Constantine's decisive turn toward Christ, with the last clearly identifiable solar imagery on his coinage appearing as late as the mid-320s. It is worth being precise about what this evidence actually suggests, rather than treating it as proof that Constantine's Christianity was simply fraudulent or insincere. Ancient religious thought, particularly among the educated elite of the late Roman world, had spent the better part of a century developing increasingly sophisticated forms of religious syncretism, blending and merging the attributes of different gods into broader, more unified conceptions of a single underlying divine power expressed through multiple names and forms. Constantine appears, for a meaningful stretch of years following his initial turn toward Christianity, to have understood Christ and Sol Invictus as compatible, even closely related expressions of the same ultimate divine.
The decree never once mentions Christianity, Christ, or any specifically Christian theological justification at all. Its language is the language of traditional Roman solar veneration, formally establishing, as an empire-wide civic institution, exactly the day that Aurelian's cult of Sol Invictus had already informally elevated to special status for decades. And yet, because that same day, the first day of the week, also happened to be the day Christians had already been observing as their own day of worship, commemorating the resurrection, Constantine's decree functioned, in practice, as the foundational civil legislation behind what is still,
2,000 years later, observed across most of the Western world as the standard weekly day of rest. An institution with such deep, unquestioned cultural penetration that the overwhelming majority of people who currently benefit from a 2-day or even a single-day weekend have absolutely no idea that its specific origin traces back to a 4th century Roman emperor attempting to honor, simultaneously and without any apparent sense of contradiction, both the sun god his father had worshipped and the resurrected
Christ his mother very likely had. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most genuinely strange pieces of Constantine's entire legacy. A man whose decisive battlefield vision supposedly converted him instantly and completely to Christianity, nonetheless spent the next decade and a half minting coins honoring a pagan sun god and issuing legislation phrased in the careful, deliberately ambiguous language of solar religion rather than explicit Christian doctrine. The gradual, genuinely messy texture of an actual historical conversion playing out across years of coexisting, overlapping religious commitments, rather than the single, clean, decisive moment that 2,000 years of subsequent retelling has consistently preferred. There is one final, quieter dimension of Constantine's life worth including before we draw this story to its close. The intellectual culture he cultivated around his own court and his own family, because it connects in a genuinely direct way back to the very beginning of tonight's narration, and the son whose death remains the story's single darkest unresolved mystery. Constantine entrusted the education of his eldest son, Crispus, to a Christian scholar named Lactantius, the same writer whose account of Constantine's dream before the Milvian Bridge survives as the earliest record of
the entire vision story, a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it means the man who preserved history's first written version of Constantine's foundational conversion narrative was simultaneously personally responsible for shaping the mind of the son Constantine would, within roughly 2 decades, order executed. The same household, the same small circle of trusted advisors, contained both the origin of Constantine's most enduring legend and the unresolved tragedy that sits uneasily beside it for anyone willing to look closely enough. Lactantius himself had been, before entering Constantine's orbit, a teacher of Latin rhetoric in the eastern city of Nicaea, the very city where Constantine had spent his own adolescence as a hostage at Diocletian's court, and where the great persecution had begun in earnest. Lactantius lost his teaching position when the persecution made his own faith a professional liability, and his eventual rise to a position of genuine trust and influence within Constantine's own household represents, in miniature, exactly the kind of personal trajectory the emperor's broader religious policy made possible for an entire generation of Christian intellectuals who had spent their early careers operating under threat and emerged within the span of a single reign into positions of genuine influence at the very center of Roman power. Constantine's court more broadly became, over the course of his reign, a genuine magnet for Christian intellectual talent in a way no previous Roman administration had ever resembled. Bishops who had once written in the careful, defensive register of a persecuted minority now found themselves corresponding directly with the emperor, shaping imperial policy and receiving state resources on a scale the church had never possessed access to before. A transformation in the social and intellectual status of Christian learning that happened, in historical terms, with almost startling speed. The span of a single human lifetime separating outright persecution from genuine intellectual prestige at the very summit of Roman society. It is this transformation, more than any single battle or any single building, that arguably represents Constantine's most durable and most genuinely transformative legacy, more durable even than Constantinople's 11 centuries of continuous habitation,
more durable than the solidus that anchored Roman currency for 700 years. The specific, irreversible shift in which faith, which texts, and which intellectual tradition would carry the deepest cultural authority across the entire subsequent history of European civilization. The writings of Christian theologians,
rather than the philosophical schools of the old pagan academies, became within a few generations of Constantine's own death the primary intellectual currency of the late Roman and then medieval world. A shift in the fundamental architecture of Western thought that no purely military or political achievement, however impressive in its own right, could ever have produced on its own. The man who began his life as the son of an innkeeper's daughter and an ambitious provincial soldier, who clawed his way to supreme power through exactly the kind of brutal, opportunistic civil warfare that had defined Roman politics for centuries before him, and who, in his own private life, proved capable of ordering the deaths of his own son and wife under circumstances that remain genuinely unresolved 17 centuries later, nonetheless managed, through some combination of genuine conviction, extraordinary political instinct, and simple historical timing, to redirect the entire subsequent trajectory of Western civilization's intellectual and religious life. A legacy considerably larger, considerably stranger, and considerably more permanent than the specific, flawed, fully human individual who happened to be standing at the center of it ever could have fully anticipated, watching the sky over the Milvian Bridge, or lying decades later in his white baptismal robes, asking finally for the water he had spent his entire adult life postponing, with Crispus dead and Fausta dead. The question of who would eventually succeed Constantine fell, by simple process of elimination, to the 3 sons Fausta had given him before her death: Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, along with 2 nephews, the sons of Constantine's deceased half-brother, who were also brought into the succession planning, and a single surviving daughter, Constantina, whose marriage prospects, like every imperial daughter before her, stretching back through Augustus's own Julia 3 centuries earlier, would be managed entirely as an instrument of dynastic politics, rather than personal preference. Constantine's solution to the succession question deviated in a genuinely significant way from the model Augustus had eventually settled on. Rather than designating a single clear heir and grooming him for sole rule, Constantine divided the empire's territory among his 3 surviving sons while he was still alive, granting each the title Caesar, and assigning each a specific region to govern under their father's overall supreme authority. A structure that, on its face, looked like a reasonable solution to the problem of dividing an empire too large for one man to govern personally, but that, in practice, simply rebuilt the exact same multi-ruler instability the Tetrarchy had already demonstrated decades earlier was almost impossible to sustain peacefully once the senior emperor who had imposed the arrangement was no longer alive to enforce it. This is precisely what happened. Within months of Constantine's own death, the careful division of power among his sons and nephews dissolved into a fresh round of dynastic murder. A substantial portion of Constantine's extended male relatives, nephews, and half-brothers were killed in a purge historians generally attribute to the ambitions of Constantine's surviving sons, particularly Constantius II, eliminating potential rivals to the succession arrangement before those rivals had any opportunity to act first. The empire Constantine had spent decades reunifying under a single hand splintered almost immediately after his death into exactly the kind of fratricidal violence his own father-in-law Maximian and brother-in-law Maxentius had once represented, proving that even the most carefully constructed succession plan could not, on its own, overcome the fundamental structural problem that had destabilized Roman imperial transitions for centuries: multiple legitimate claimants,
each commanding real military force and no mechanism beyond.
Raw violence to settle which of them, God or fortune, actually intended to rule. In the final years of his own life, Constantine, by this point in his mid-60s, turned his attention toward a military threat that had troubled Roman emperors for centuries, and that none had ever managed to permanently resolve: the Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's great rival power along its eastern frontier. Tensions with the Persian king Shapur II had been escalating for years, partly over territorial disputes along the contested border regions of Mesopotamia and Armenia, and partly in a detail that connects directly back to Constantine's own religious transformation, over the treatment of Christian communities living within Persian territory, communities Constantine, by this point firmly established as Christianity's great imperial patron, felt a genuine sense of personal obligation to protect. He began assembling what ancient sources describe as a genuinely massive invasion force, and, in a detail Eusebius records with obvious and considerable enthusiasm, arranged for Christian bishops to accompany the army, along with a specially constructed tent designed to function as a mobile church, so that the campaign against Persia could be conducted, in its outward presentation at least, as something considerably closer to
a Christian crusade than a conventional Roman territorial war, centuries before that specific word would even exist to describe such an undertaking. The campaign never happened. In the spring of 337 AD, not long after the Christian celebration of Easter, Constantine fell seriously ill. The specific nature of his illness is not recorded with enough medical detail for modern historians to offer any confident diagnosis. He traveled first to hot mineral springs near Constantinople seeking treatment, a fairly conventional remedy for the ailments of old age in the ancient world. And when the waters failed to improve his condition, he continued on toward Helenopolis, the city he had renamed in honor of his own mother, who had died roughly a decade earlier, praying at a church he had built there in honor of an early Christian martyr. It was here, sensing that his illness was likely fatal, that Constantine finally requested the baptism he had postponed for his entire adult life. By Eusebius's account, he had genuinely hoped to be baptized in the Jordan River itself, the same river in which Christian tradition held that Jesus had been baptized. A final, symbolically perfect pilgrimage that his declining health no longer
allowed him to complete, settling instead for baptism in the considerably more modest setting of a suburban villa outside Nicomedia, performed by the local bishop, also named Eusebius, though a different man from Constantine's eventual biographer. A bishop whose own theological sympathies leaned toward exactly the Arian position the Council of Nicaea had officially condemned 12 years earlier. A final, quietly significant detail that complicates any simple narrative of Constantine dying in full, settled Orthodox confidence. Constantine died on the 22nd of May, 337 AD, on the holiday of Pentecost, still wearing the white baptismal robes that Christian custom required new converts to wear for a period following their baptism, having spent, by his own apparent design, the very last days of his life as a newly minted Christian, rather than the decades-long, ambiguous patron and fellow traveler he had been for the rest of his reign. A final, carefully timed act of religious commitment that, whether driven by genuine theological conviction about the cleansing power of baptism, simple practical caution about dying with as few unconfessed sins as possible, or some combination of both motivations that even Constantine himself might not have been able to fully separate,
brought his extraordinarily long and extraordinarily consequential reign to its actual, literal close. Before his death, Constantine had made arrangements for his own burial that reveal, as clearly as any single decision in his entire life,
the unique and almost unprecedented religious position he believed he occupied. He had constructed, within the Church of the Holy Apostles in his new capital, a mausoleum designed specifically to surround his own sarcophagus with monuments commemorating the 12 apostles, 6 on each side, positioning his own tomb quite literally as a 13th apostolic monument, sharing sacred space with the original followers of Christ himself. It is difficult to overstate how extraordinary this arrangement actually was. No previous Roman emperor, however extensively the imperial cult had encouraged the veneration of living and dead rulers as godlike figures, had ever attempted anything quite this specific. A burial designed to position the emperor not simply as divinely favored, the conventional language of imperial propaganda for centuries, but as something close to a member of the Apostolic College itself, a man who, despite spending the overwhelming majority of his life unbaptized, conventionally married, and waging the same kind of brutal dynastic warfare that had characterized every
Christianity as the empire's official state religion, and beginning, in earnest, the active suppression of the traditional pagan worship Constantine had merely declined to actively destroy, a trajectory Constantine set in motion without necessarily intending, or living to see, its full and considerably more aggressive eventual conclusion. The historical verdict on Constantine has shifted dramatically across the centuries since his death, in ways that track with remarkable precision the religious and political commitments of whoever happened to be doing the judging. Medieval Christian writers, working almost entirely from Eusebius's deeply flattering biography and the considerable body of legend that accumulated around Constantine in the centuries following his death, including the entirely fabricated 8th century forgery known as the Donation of Constantine, which falsely claimed the emperor had granted the Bishop of Rome supreme authority over the entire Western Empire, remembered him as something close to a saint, a perfect, divinely chosen instrument for bringing the Roman world to Christ. It is worth pausing specifically on Eusebius, because nearly every striking detail in tonight's account, the vision, the dream, the deathbed baptism, the request to be buried among the apostles, ultimately traces back to a single source, a bishop who knew Constantine.
Constantine personally, who benefited enormously and directly from his patronage, and who composed his biography of the emperor only after Constantine's death, with no living subject left to contradict or correct the account. Eusebius was, by his own explicit framing, writing panegyric, formal ceremonial praise, rather than what a modern reader would recognize as objective history. His earlier work, A History of the Christian Church itself, makes no mention of any vision at the Milvian Bridge at all, which means the man whose later biography would become the single most influential source for Constantine's entire religious transformation had years earlier, while the emperor was very much alive and might easily have corrected him, written an account of the exact same period that simply left the miracle out entirely. This does not mean Eusebius invented the story from nothing. The earlier Lactantius account of the dream, considerably more modest in its claims, was already circulating during Constantine's own lifetime. But it does mean that the considerably more dramatic, considerably more famous version most people actually know, the cross blazing in the daytime sky, the voice promising victory, was assembled, embellished, and given its final, enduring shape by a single court biographer.
Writing for an audience that had every reason to want the story told as impressively as the available material would allow, and no living emperor left to insist on more modest accuracy, Renaissance humanists and later Enlightenment historians considerably more skeptical of institutional Christianity generally, and considerably more interested in the messy secular reality beneath the pious legend, began the long process of reconstructing the considerably more complicated man this narration has attempted to describe. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing his monumental history of Rome's decline in the 18th century, treated Constantine with a notably more critical eye than the medieval tradition had allowed, emphasizing the executions, the political calculation, and the genuinely ambiguous nature of a conversion that took decades to produce a single baptism. Modern historians, working with considerably more sophisticated tools for evaluating the surviving sources against each other, have generally settled into a position that sits somewhere between these two poles. Neither the perfect Christian saint of Eusebius's flattering biography, nor the simple, cynical opportunist that more secular critics have sometimes wanted to find, but a genuinely transitional figure, a man who began his reign as a conventional Roman polytheist devoted to solar religion, who experienced a remarkable conversion.
Something, whether a battlefield vision, a dream, or simply a gradual and genuine theological conviction that built slowly across years of increasing exposure to Christian thought and Christian advisors, that pushed him toward an escalating, evidently sincere commitment to the new faith, while never fully shedding the brutal, pragmatic, occasionally murderous instincts that every single Roman ruler before him, pagan or otherwise, had relied on simply to survive in a political system that had executed or assassinated the overwhelming majority of emperors who held the office before him. It is worth, before closing, stepping back far enough to see the entire shape of the story this channel has now told across 3 separate emperors, because Constantine's life only fully makes sense in the considerably longer arc that began nearly 4 centuries earlier, with a teenager named Octavian standing in front of a Senate his own adoptive father had broken beyond repair. Julius Caesar reached for permanent personal power while keeping the visible markers of that power dangerously legible, the dictatorship for life, the statues among the kings, and was killed for it by men who genuinely believed that removing one ambitious individual could restore a 500-year-old constitutional order that had, in reality, already finished collapsing decades earlier. Augustus learned the lesson his adoptive father's death had taught with brutal clarity, and built instead a careful, patient theater of restraint, never claiming a crown, never abandoning the fiction that the Senate still governed, accumulating over 50 years considerably more total power than Caesar had ever openly claimed, while ensuring that the specific, visible markers of that power remained modest enough that nobody felt compelled to reach for a dagger. The republic he claimed to restore never actually returned, only its appearance did, maintained so carefully and for so long that the appearance itself eventually became, for nearly every practical purpose, identical to the reality it had quietly replaced. Constantine inherited a system 3 centuries further down that same road, an empire whose population had long since stopped expecting anything resembling genuine republican governance, ruled by emperors who, by his own era, already wore jeweled diadems and accepted forms of court ceremony considerably closer to outright monarchy than anything Augustus himself would have dared risk. And into that already monarchical system, Constantine introduced something genuinely new, not simply a transfer of supreme political power, which Rome had managed and mismanaged for centuries by this point, but a transfer of supreme religious allegiance. An empire that had spent its entire previous history defining political loyalty through participation in the traditional civic cult of the old gods, now found that loyalty redefined, gradually but irreversibly, around a single exclusive faith
that had spent its first 3 centuries as a persecuted, frequently despised minority. The through line connecting all 3 men across nearly 400 years of Roman history is not simply ambition. Every man who ever wore a Roman crown, formal or informal, possessed that in abundance. It is the considerably rarer skill of recognizing with real clarity exactly which story a given moment in history actually needed told, and then having the discipline, and frequently the ruthlessness, to make sure that story, rather than some less convenient version of the truth, was the one that survived. Caesar told Rome a story about Gallic conquest and personal clemency, and it nearly worked, until the visible markers of his ambition outran what the story could cover. Augustus told Rome a story about restored liberty, and made that story durable enough to survive for centuries, specifically by never once contradicting it with an overreach.
As visible as his predecessors, Constantine told the entire Mediterranean world a story about divine favor and a single victorious sign in the sky. A story considerably more useful, considerably more durable, and considerably more consequential than even Augustus's careful theater, because it did not simply secure one man's reign. It redirected the entire subsequent religious history of Western civilization. And it did this even though the actual documented texture of Constantine's life, the executed son, the murdered wife, the decades-long delay before his own baptism, the coins honoring a sun god minted years after his supposedly decisive conversion, sits considerably more uneasily beside that clean, triumphant story than most of the 2 billion people who now practice the faith he legalized have ever had occasion to learn. This is, in the end, the actual lesson connecting Caesar's Senate house, Augustus's golden shield, and Constantine's vision at the Milvian Bridge. The men who shape the largest, most durable institutions in human history are rarely the men who simply hold the most power in a given moment. They are the men who understand, with an instinct that approaches genuine genius, exactly which version of their own story a civilization is, ready to believe, and who possess the patience, the calculation, and frequently the willingness to do genuinely terrible things in private, required to make sure that version is the one carved into the marble, minted onto the coin, and recited every single week by people who will never know the considerably stranger, considerably more human truth standing just behind it. Constantine's own calendar, the 7-day week with Sunday at its head, the very rhythm by which most of the modern world still organizes its working lives and its days of rest, sits today beside Caesar's months and Augustus's, July and August, side by side. 3 names from a single dynasty of storytellers, still quietly governing how thoroughly modern people, who have never read a word of Suetonius or Eusebius, nonetheless structure their entire lives around the specific choices these 3 men made, for reasons considerably more complicated, considerably more contradictory, and considerably more human than the stories they left behind ever fully admitted. Carry that with you. The wheel still turns the way he built it, and somewhere in that quiet turning, layered beneath Caesar's calendar and Augustus's careful theater, he is still here too. The physical world he built has fared across 17 centuries considerably better than most of his contemporaries could have reasonably expected. The city he founded still stands, under a different name and a different faith, its ancient walls still tracing, in long stretches, the same boundary he himself purportedly walked out decades before they were finished. The Arch of Constantine
with its deliberately vague inscription crediting victory to an unnamed divinity rather than any specific Christian sign, still stands in Rome beside the Colosseum, photographed by millions of visitors every year who walk past it without necessarily knowing that its careful silence on the subject of crosses and visions is itself one of the most genuinely informative pieces of evidence historians have ever recovered about what actually happened at the Milvian Bridge. The foundations of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rebuilt and fought over and rebuilt again across nearly 2,000 years of subsequent conflict, still mark the site Constantine's own builders first consecrated in Jerusalem. And the basilica he raised over the Apostle Peter's reputed grave in Rome, demolished and entirely rebuilt over more than a century during the Renaissance, still anchors, in its modern form, the exact same patch of ground.
The geography of an empire that no longer exists, still quietly organizing where billions of people direct their attention and their devotion, nearly 2,000 years after the specific, complicated, frequently ruthless man who first decided these particular places deserved monuments at all.